John Harper wasn't just a farmer. He was a man tied to the land by blood, sweat, and decades of memories. His family had been farming this patch of earth in the Midwest for generations. It all started with his grandfather, who rolled up his sleeves during the Great Depression and turned barren soil into fertile fields. Back then, life was hard, but it was simple. You worked the land, you fed your family, and if there was anything left over, you shared it with the neighbors. That's how things were done. For John, the farm wasn't just a business, it was home. Every corner of the property held a story. The old oak tree near the barn, that's where he carved his initials as a kid. The rusted tractor parked behind. The shed. His dad used to drive it every spring, humming tunes while plowing the fields. Even the creaky wooden fence posts seemed alive with history. But times change, and so did farming. Crop prices dropped, debts piled up, and no matter how hard John tried, he couldn't keep pace with the bills. When the bank finally sent foreclosure papers, it hit him like a punch to the gut. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the official letter, John felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just about losing money, it was about losing everything his family had built. For days he wandered around the farm, unable to focus on work or even eat properly. What would happen now? Would the bank sell off the land piece by piece? Would some big corporation come in and turn these fields into something unrecognizable? But amidst all the chaos, one thing gave John a sliver of hope: the airstrip. Tucked away on the far edge of the property, it was easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for. A long strip of dirt and grass, cracked and uneven in places, stretched across the landscape. It had been there since World War II, back when pilots trained here before heading overseas. Over time, people forgot about it, and nature started reclaiming it. Weeds sprouted between the cracks, and rainstorms left ruts that made landing tricky. But John never let it go completely. No matter how bad things got, he kept coming back to the airstrip, pulling out weeds, smoothing over bumps, and making sure it stayed usable. To outsiders, this might have looked strange. Why waste energy on an old airstrip when he didn't even own the land anymore? Some folks in town whispered behind his back, calling him stubborn or foolish. Let it go, they'd say. It's not yours anymore. But John saw the airstrip differently. To him, it wasn't just a stretch of dirt. It was a lifeline, a connection to something bigger than himself. When he walked along its length, feeling the cool breeze against his face, he felt free. Free from the weight of failure, free from the judgment of others, free from the crushing reality of losing the farm. Every once in a while, small planes would show up unexpectedly. Amateur pilots flying solo trips or retirees reliving their glory. Days would spot the airstrip from above and decide to land. They'd step out of their planes, curious about the man maintaining such an odd relic. John always welcomed them with a smile, offering cups of strong black coffee brewed on a portable stove. These visitors brought more than just company. They brought stories, tales of adventures in far-off places, tales of struggles overcome, tales of dreams still burning bright despite setbacks. Listening to them reminded John that he wasn't alone. There were others out there fighting their own battles, holding on to their own pieces of hope. As weeks turned into months, John settled into a routine. Each morning, he'd wake up early, grab his tools, and head to the airstrip. He'd spend hours working on it, fixing what he could with limited resources. Sometimes he'd sit on the tailgate of his truck, watching the horizon and wondering what the future held. Would anyone care about this place once he was gone? Would the airstrip disappear entirely, swallowed by weeds and forgotten by time? Despite the doubts gnawing at him, John refused to give up. Deep down, he believed that keeping the airstrip alive mattered. Not just for him, but for something greater. Maybe someday someone would need it. Maybe someday it would serve a purpose beyond what he could imagine. Little did he know that day was closer than he thought. John's days were long, but they weren't empty. Even after the bank took the farm, he found purpose in maintaining the airstrip. It became his ritual, his anchor in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. Every morning, he'd wake up with the sun and head straight to the dirt runway. He didn't have much, just an old pair of gloves, a rake, and a stubborn determination. But that was enough for him. He'd pull weeds by hand, smooth out ruts left by rainstorms, and clear away rocks or debris that could make landing dangerous for pilots. To some, this might seem pointless. After all, what good was an old airstrip on foreclosed land? But John saw it differently. This wasn't just about dirt and grass. It was about holding on to something meaningful. The first time a small plane landed after the foreclosure, John felt a flicker of pride. The pilot, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a leather jacket, stepped out and looked around in surprise. "Didn't expect to find anyone here," the man said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I refuel and take off again?" John shook his head and offered him coffee from his thermos instead. They sat together under the shade of an old oak tree, talking about flying, life, and the challenges of keeping dreams alive. That conversation stayed with John long after the plane disappeared into the sky. For the first time in months, he felt useful, like he still had something to offer. Word spread among local pilots about the little airstrip tucked away on the edge of town. Some came because they needed a place to land during bad weather. Others stopped by out of curiosity, drawn by stories of the farmer who refused to let the runway go. Each visit brought new faces and fresh perspectives. One day, a retired airline captain landed in a tiny two-seater plane. He told John about his adventures flying across oceans and continents, sharing tales of storms survived and sunsets witnessed at 30,000 feet. Another time, a young woman with braided hair and a bright smile touched down. She was training for her pilot's license and wanted to practice takeoffs and landings on shorter runways. "You've done an amazing job keeping this place alive," she said before climbing back into her cockpit. Those words meant more to John than she probably realized, but not everyone understood why John cared so much about the airstrip. His neighbors thought he was wasting his time, or worse, clinging to something he couldn't afford to keep. "Why bother?" one of them asked during a chance encounter at the gas station. "It's not like you own it anymore." John didn't argue. He knew how it looked from the outside, a broke farmer obsessing over a crumbling strip of dirt while his life fell apart. But deep down, he believed the airstrip mattered, not just to him, but to the community. Sure, no one used it regularly, but it was there when people needed it. And isn't that what real value is? Being ready, even if most days nothing happens? Life wasn't easy, though. Living in a trailer parked near the airstrip was humbling. John missed the warmth of his farmhouse, the smell of wood burning in the fireplace, and the comfort of knowing exactly where he belonged. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake in the cramped space, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, he'd wonder if he was fighting a losing battle. Was he fooling himself into thinking the airstrip could change anything? Or was he just delaying the inevitable? Still, there were moments when doubt gave way to hope. Like the evening he watched a sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink while sitting on the tailgate of his truck. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding silently across the ground. In that moment, everything felt quiet and vast, like the world stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. John remembered his grandfather telling him stories about how the land used to feel limitless back in the early days. Back then, the future seemed full of possibilities. Maybe, John thought, it wasn't too late to dream again. One chilly afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled across the runway, John noticed something unusual. A low rumble echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. At first, he thought it was thunder, but the sound was deeper, heavier. Then he saw it. A massive aircraft descending through the clouds, far bigger than any plane that had ever landed here before. Panic surged through him. What was happening? Had someone reported him for staying on foreclosed property? Was this some kind of enforcement action? As the plane touched down with surprising grace given its size, John froze, unsure whether to run or confront whoever stepped off the ramp. When the engines finally powered down and the dust settled, John cautiously approached the aircraft. Its sheer size dwarfed everything around it, including the tiny propeller planes that usually visited. The door opened, and out stepped a woman wearing civilian clothes instead of a military uniform. She looked startled to see him standing there. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, holding up her hands. We didn't realize anyone lived nearby. We're scientists. We had an emergency situation and needed a place to land. John blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Scientists? Emergency landing? None of this made sense. But as the woman explained their mission and how they'd stumbled upon his airstrip using satellite maps, John began to understand. These weren't invaders or enforcers. They were explorers, searching for answers hidden beneath the soil. And somehow his little patch of land held a secret that could change everything. For him, for the town, and maybe even for the entire region. For the first time in years, John felt a spark of excitement. This wasn't just about saving the airstrip anymore. It was about discovering what else might be possible if only he kept believing. The massive plane sat on the airstrip like a giant bird resting after a long flight. John stood there staring at it, his heart still racing from the surprise. The woman who had stepped off the aircraft walked closer, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. She looked around, taking in the cracked runway and the overgrown edges of the field. "This place is impressive," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure whether to call it charming or just plain odd. John nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. He was still trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. A few minutes ago, he'd been alone with nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant caw of crows. Now, this colossal machine and its crew had landed right in the middle of his world. "What exactly are you doing out here?" he finally asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts spinning through his mind. The woman introduced herself as part of a team working with the U.S. Geological Survey. They were mapping underground resources using advanced imaging equipment mounted on the plane. Their mission had taken them across several states, scanning beneath the surface to identify water reserves, minerals, and other hidden treasures. But something unexpected had happened earlier that day. Bad weather forced them to look for an emergency landing site. Satellite maps showed this old airstrip, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and they decided to take a chance. "We didn't think anyone would be here," she admitted, glancing toward John's trailer parked nearby. "When we saw the condition of the runway, we figured it might have been abandoned years ago." Her eyes softened as she added, "Clearly, we were wrong." John felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved they weren't there, to evict him or shut down the airstrip. On the other, he couldn't help but feel defensive. This was his land, or at least it used to be. He'd poured countless hours into keeping the airstrip alive, even when no one else cared. And now, these strangers had swooped in without warning, bringing their big plane and high-tech gadgets into his quiet corner of the world. But as the woman continued talking, explaining their work and apologizing for the intrusion, John began to see things differently. There was sincerity in her voice, a genuine respect for what he'd done. She didn't treat him like some relic of the past or a nuisance standing in their way. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about why he'd kept the airstrip going all these years. "Most people would have walked away," she said, shaking her head. "You must really care about this place." Her words hit home. For so long, John had felt like he was fighting a losing battle, clinging to something that didn't matter to anyone else. But hearing her say that made him realize he wasn't just holding on to the past. He was preserving something valuable. Something that apparently could still serve a purpose. As the rest of the team disembarked from the plane, John got a closer look at their operation. The C-17 was enormous, far bigger than anything he'd ever seen up close. It carried not only the scientists but also rows of sophisticated equipment, computers, sensors, and machines he couldn't begin to understand. One of the crew members explained how the ground-penetrating radar worked, sending signals deep into the earth to create detailed maps of what lay below. John listened intently, fascinated by the idea of seeing beneath the surface without digging a single hole. Over the next hour, the team unpacked their gear and set up near the edge of the airstrip. John stayed close, watching as they calibrated their devices and prepared to scan the area. Despite his initial hesitation, he found himself drawn into their world. These weren't just scientists. They were explorers, uncovering secrets buried beneath layers of soil and rock. And somehow his little airstrip had become the gateway to their discovery. The woman leading the team noticed John's interest and invited him to join them as they worked. At first he hesitated. What could he possibly contribute? He wasn't a scientist or an engineer, he was just a farmer, or at least he used to be. But curiosity got the better of him, and soon he was walking alongside them, learning about their process and asking questions whenever he dared. The crew was patient, answering his queries with enthusiasm. They treated him like a partner, not an outsider, and that meant more to John than he could put into words. By late afternoon, the team had gathered enough data to start analyzing. They huddled around their laptops, pointing at colorful images that appeared on the screens. John leaned in, squinting at the patterns. To him it looked like a jumble of lines and shapes, but the scientists spoke excitedly, interpreting what they saw. Then, one of them let out a low whistle. "This is incredible," he muttered, tapping the screen. "Look at this." John's stomach tightened. Whatever they'd found, it was clearly significant. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We need to double-check the readings," she said carefully. "But if this is accurate, it changes everything." "What do you mean?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "It looks like there's a massive aquifer under this land, an underground reservoir of fresh water, one of the largest we've ever encountered." For a moment, John couldn't speak. His mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. Water was life, especially in farming communities like his. Droughts had plagued the region for years, forcing farmers to cut back on crops or abandon their fields altogether. If what she said was true, if there really was a vast supply of water hidden beneath the soil, it could mean salvation for countless families, including his own. But as the weight of the discovery sank in, John felt another wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just about water. It was about hope. Hope for the future, for the town, for the generations yet to come. And somehow this old airstrip, the one he'd fought so hard to protect, had played a role in bringing it to light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the field, John stood silently, watching the scientists pack up their equipment. He realized something important in that moment. Sometimes the smallest acts of perseverance can lead to the biggest breakthroughs. All those mornings spent pulling weeds, smoothing ruts, and clearing rocks hadn't been wasted. Effort. They'd been building toward this. A day when the airstrip proved its worth in ways he never could have imagined. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and purple, John found himself standing near the edge of the airstrip, his mind buzzing with questions. The scientists were packing up their gear, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that this discovery was about more than just water. It felt like a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who called this small corner of the Midwest home. The woman leading the team approached him again, her expression thoughtful. "We'll need to confirm our findings," she said, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. "But if this aquifer is as large as it seems, it could be life-changing for this region." She paused, looking at John directly. "You know, we wouldn't have found it without your airstrip. If this place hadn't been here, if you hadn't kept it ready, we might never have landed." Her words hit John like a punch to the chest, though not in a bad way. For years he'd doubted himself, wondering if his efforts mattered. He'd faced judgment from neighbors, struggled with loneliness, and questioned whether holding on to the airstrip made any sense. But now, hearing someone say that his work had actually meant something, it gave him a rush of pride he hadn't felt in ages. "I didn't do much," John replied modestly, scratching the back of his neck. "Just kept the runway clear, patched up what I could. Anyone else would have done the same." She shook her head firmly. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have walked away after losing the farm. They wouldn't have seen the value in maintaining something that seemed useless. But you did. You saw beyond the surface even when no one else did." John didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised, especially not by strangers. All he'd ever wanted was to hold on to a piece of his family's legacy, to keep alive the memories tied to this land. But now, it felt like there was a greater purpose behind everything he'd done, a reason for all those early mornings spent pulling weeds and smoothing dirt. The next morning, the scientists returned to finish their scans. John woke up before dawn, unable to sleep. His mind raced with possibilities. What would happen if the aquifer turned out to be real? Would the town rally around the discovery? Would farmers finally get relief from the droughts that had squeezed them dry year after year? And what about him? Where would he fit into all of this? He brewed a pot of coffee and brought it outside, setting up a makeshift table near the trailer. When the team arrived, he offered them cups, eager to hear updates. Over steaming mugs, they explained their plan to analyze the data further and share their findings with local authorities. "This isn't just a scientific breakthrough," one of them said. "It's a chance to rebuild communities, to give people hope when they've been struggling for so long." John listened intently, nodding along. As they talked, he realized something important. This wasn't just about water or farming. It was about connection. For years, John had felt isolated, cut off from the world after losing the farm. But now, standing here with these scientists, sharing stories and ideas, he felt part of something bigger. These weren't just outsiders passing through. They were partners in uncovering something extraordinary. Later that day, the team invited John to join them as they explored the area surrounding the airstrip. Using handheld devices, they mapped out potential access points for drilling wells or setting up irrigation systems. John walked alongside them, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of history about the land. "That hill over there," he said, gesturing toward a rise in the distance. "My grandfather used to call it Hope Hill, said it reminded him that no matter how tough things got, there was always a way forward." The comment earned a smile from the group. One of the younger members teased, "Guess we're proving." "Your grandpa, right, huh?" John chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in months. There was something magical about seeing others appreciate the land he loved so deeply. Growing up, he'd always heard stories about how his ancestors worked together, with neighbors to survive hard times. Now, decades later, it felt like that spirit of cooperation was coming full circle. By evening, the team had gathered enough information to feel confident in their initial findings. The aquifer was real and massive. Deep beneath the soil lay millions of gallons of fresh water, untouched and untapped for centuries. The implications were staggering. With careful management, this resource could sustain the entire region for generations to come. As the scientists packed up their equipment, once more the woman leading the team pulled John aside. "Listen," she said, her tone serious but kind. "This discovery belongs to everyone, but it started with you. Without your airstrip, none of this would have happened. We'll make sure you're recognized for your role in this." John blinked, caught off guard. Recognition wasn't something he'd ever sought. He'd simply done what felt right, holding onto the airstrip because it meant something to him. But hearing her acknowledge his contribution made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure of what else to say. She smiled warmly. "No, thank you. This is just the beginning. For you, for us, for everyone here." When the C-17 took off the following morning, leaving behind only tire tracks and echoes of its engines, John stood watching until it disappeared into the clouds. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. His little airstrip had proven its worth in ways he never could have imagined. It wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a bridge to the future, a future filled with promise. Over the next few days, word spread quickly about the aquifer. Local leaders came knocking, wanting to learn more. Farmers stopped by, curious about how the discovery might help them. Even old neighbors who'd once criticized John for clinging to the airstrip showed up, offering apologies and congratulations. Suddenly, the man who'd been written off as stubborn and foolish became a symbol of resilience and foresight. Through it all, John stayed grounded. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Managing such a valuable resource would require collaboration, compromise, and trust. Things that didn't come naturally to everyone. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. The airstrip had brought people together in ways he'd never dreamed possible. One night, sitting under the stars with a cup of coffee in hand, John reflected on how far he'd come. Losing the farm had felt like the end of the world. But now, he saw it differently. Sometimes endings are just new beginnings in disguise, and sometimes the smallest acts of perseverance can lead to the biggest miracles. Word about the aquifer spread faster than anyone expected. It started small, whispers among farmers at the local diner, a brief mention in the town newspaper. But within days it grew into something much bigger. Reporters from nearby cities began showing up, cameras slung over their shoulders and notebooks in hand. Government officials made calls, wanting to know more about this hidden treasure beneath the soil. Environmental groups reached out, eager to ensure the resource would be managed responsibly. And through it all, John found himself at the center of the storm. At first, he wasn't sure how to handle the attention. For years, he'd lived quietly, keeping to himself and focusing on the airstrip. Now, people were knocking on his trailer door at all hours, asking questions, seeking advice, or just wanting to shake his hand. Some called him a hero. Others referred to him as a guardian of the land. The praise felt strange but also comforting. After so many months of feeling invisible, it was nice to matter again. But with the spotlight came challenges. Not everyone agreed on what should happen next. Farmers wanted immediate access to the water to save their crops. Local leaders argued for a long-term plan that would benefit the entire community. Environmentalists insisted on safeguards to prevent overuse and protect ecosystems. Everyone had an opinion, and tensions ran high during meetings held in the town hall. Voices rose, tempers flared, and more than once John wondered if they'd ever find common ground. Through it all, John tried to stay calm. He knew firsthand how hard it was to balance hope with practicality. When the bank foreclosed on the farm, he'd spent countless nights lying awake, imagining ways to turn things around. Most of those ideas had been unrealistic, pipe dreams born out of desperation, but they'd kept him going. Now, sitting in these heated discussions, he understood why compromise mattered so much. If everyone focused only on what they wanted, nothing would get done. One evening, after yet another exhausting meeting, John sat outside his trailer, staring at the stars. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly turned earth. A car pulled up, headlights cutting through the darkness. Out stepped one of the government representatives who'd been involved in the talks, a middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses perched on his nose. He looked tired too, his suit wrinkled and tie loosened. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, gesturing toward the folding chair next to John. John shrugged. "Suit yourself." The man sank into the chair, with a heavy sigh. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there listening to the crickets chirp and the wind rustle through the trees. Finally, the man broke the silence. "This is complicated, isn't it?" John chuckled softly. "You think?" The man smiled faintly. "I've seen situations like this before. People get excited about a discovery, but then reality sets in. Everyone wants a piece of it, and no one agrees on how to move forward." John nodded. "Yeah, sounds about right. But here's the thing," the man continued, leaning forward. "This isn't just about water. It's about trust. You've got farmers who've struggled for years, townsfolk who want to see their community thrive, and outsiders worried about protecting the environment. All valid concerns, but none of it works unless people start trusting each other." John thought about that for a moment. Trust. It was such a simple word, yet so hard to build. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when the bank took the farm. Neighbors had stopped talking to him, assuming he'd failed because he wasn't good enough. Even family members had distanced themselves, unsure how to help or maybe afraid of being dragged down too. But now, sitting here with this stranger, he realized trust could be rebuilt. It just took time and effort. "What do you think we should do?" John asked, turning to the man. The representative sighed. "Honestly, start small. Bring people together. Not to argue, but to listen. Let them share their stories, their fears, their hopes. Once they see each other as humans instead of opponents, solutions will come easier. It sounded simple, almost too easy. But John liked the idea. Over the next few weeks, he worked with local leaders to organize informal gatherings. Instead of formal meetings in the stuffy town hall, they met in barns, backyards, and even the old church basement. Coffee and homemade pies replaced PowerPoint presentations. Conversations flowed freely, without agendas or timers dictating when someone could speak. These gatherings revealed something surprising. Despite their differences, everyone shared the same core desire: to create a better future for the next generation. Farmers talked about passing down healthy fields to their kids. Parents dreamed of stable jobs and thriving schools. Young people envisioned opportunities to stay in the town where they'd grown up instead of moving away. Slowly but surely, walls began to crumble. One night, during a particularly lively discussion, a young woman stood up. She was barely 20, her hands calloused from working in the fields alongside her father. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words carried weight. "We can't let this chance slip away," she said. "This aquifer, it's not just water. It's hope. Hope that things can get better, that we don't have to keep struggling forever." Her speech brought tears to more than one pair of eyes, including John's. It reminded him of why he'd fought so hard to keep the airstrip alive. Like the young woman said, it wasn't just about dirt and grass. It was about holding on to hope, even when everything else seemed lost. As weeks turned into months, plans began taking shape. Scientists worked closely with engineers to design sustainable ways to access the aquifer. Farmers collaborated with environmentalists to implement conservation practices. Local businesses pitched in, offering resources and expertise. Through it all, John remained a steady presence, bridging gaps between groups and reminding everyone of the bigger picture. Not everything went smoothly. There were setbacks, equipment delays, disagreements over funding, unexpected technical challenges. But every time frustration threatened to boil over, someone would step up and remind the group of why they'd started this journey in the first place. That sense of purpose kept them moving forward. By the time spring arrived, progress was undeniable. New wells dotted the landscape, providing fresh water to parched fields. Irrigation systems hummed to life, bringing green back to lands that had been brown for years. The airstrip, once a quiet relic of the past, transformed into a hub of activity. Planes delivered supplies and equipment, while visitors came from neighboring towns to learn about the project. Pilots who'd landed here before returned, marveling at how much had changed. For John, the transformation was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt immense pride knowing the airstrip had played a role in reviving the community. On the other, he sometimes missed the solitude of those early mornings, when it was just him and the runway. But even that nostalgia couldn't overshadow the joy he felt watching life return to the land he loved. One afternoon, as he walked along the airstrip, pulling weeds and smoothing ruts like he always did, a small plane descended from the sky. It touched down gracefully, kicking up clouds of dust. Out stepped a familiar face, the woman who'd led the scientific team months earlier. She waved as she approached, her smile warm and genuine. "You look busy," she said, glancing at I. The tools in John's hands, he grinned. "Old habits die hard." She laughed. "Well, I'm glad some things haven't changed. This place still feels like home." Her words struck a chord. Home. That's exactly what the airstrip and the surrounding land had become for so many people. A place where hope took root, where collaboration flourished, and where dreams found room to grow. As John watched the woman walk toward the growing crowd gathering near the trailer, he realized something important. Sometimes, the greatest legacies aren't built alone. They're created together, brick by brick, drop by drop, until they form something unshakable.